hidden behind iron gates and ivy-covered walls, lies a mansion that the world chose to forget. Once a symbol of untold wealth and ambition, its halls whisper stories of grandeur built on sacrifice, ambition, and unseen labor. Gold and marble may shine, but what price was paid to construct this empire of excess? Tonight, we step inside the shadows of opulence, uncovering the lives, the struggles, and the secrets that history almost erased. The mansion was built to be unforgettable. It rose from the landscape not as a home, but as a declaration. Stone by stone, it announced that wealth had conquered time, that money could shape memory, and that power could outlive its owner. When it was completed, newspapers described it as a triumph of ambition, a private palace designed to rival the great estates of Europe. Its halls were vast, its windows tall, its grounds manicured to perfection. To the outside world, it symbolized success at its highest peak. But symbols rarely tell the whole truth. The fortune behind the mansion did not appear overnight. It was extracted from railroads, industry, finance, and labor systems that rewarded a few while consuming many. Wealth flowed upward through structures that valued expansion over consequence. The mansion became the physical result of those systems, a place where excess was normalized and inequality was invisible behind polished surfaces. Every carved staircase and imported fixture represented hours of labor performed far from the spotlight, lives spent sustaining a dream they would never enter. Inside, the mansion functioned less as a residence and more as a stage. Guests arrived not to relax, but to witness. Dinners were performances, conversations were transactions, alliances formed beneath chandeliers, while servants moved silently through corridors designed to keep them unseen. The building trained everyone inside it to understand hierarchy without explanation. Space itself enforced power. The larger the room, the higher the status. The quieter the footsteps, the lower the position. Beyond its gates, the country was changing, cities grew crowded, workers organized, inequality became harder to ignore. Yet inside the mansion, time seemed suspended. Wealth insulated its owners from the instability outside, reinforcing the illusion that such protection was permanent. The estate suggested that success, once achieved, could be preserved indefinitely. That illusion would not survive the next generation. As fortunes shifted and public attitudes hardened, the mansion's meaning began to change. What was once admired became questioned. Excess no longer inspired awe but discomfort. The building remained physically intact but socially out of place. It represented a version of wealth that no longer aligned with the country's self-image. Maintaining it required enormous expense, and justifying that expense grew increasingly difficult in a society beginning to scrutinize inherited privilege. The first signs of abandonment were subtle. Rooms closed, staff numbers shrank, repairs were delayed. What had once been meticulously maintained began to show wear. Paint cracked, gardens lost their precision. The mansion did not collapse suddenly. It faded. Its decline mirrored the slow erosion of unquestioned authority that once protected it. Public narratives shifted as well. Stories about innovation and opportunity replaced celebrations of pure wealth. The mansion no longer fit neatly into the national story. Preserving it meant preserving an uncomfortable past, one that exposed how deeply inequality was woven into the foundations of success. Forgetting it became easier than explaining it. When discussions of preservation emerged, they were framed in practical terms. Cost outweighed value. Purpose outweighed history. The mansion occupied land that could be repurposed, modernized, made productive again. Arguments against saving it rarely addressed what was truly at stake. It was not just a building under debate, but a question of memory. What does a nation choose to remember, and what does it quietly erase? The decision to let it disappear was not announced as an act of destruction. It was presented as progress. Demolition was framed as necessity, not choice. The mansion was reduced to rubble with efficiency and justification. Photographs documented the process, but context was stripped away. What remained was empty space, cleared and ready for a new narrative. With its destruction, something else vanished. A tangible reminder of how wealth once operated, how power once presented itself, and how inequality was normalized through architecture. Without the building, the story became abstract. It became easier to speak of the past without confronting its physical evidence. Memory softened, accountability blurred. The mansion's absence created a cleaner landscape, both literally and symbolically. The land could be reused without explanation. The skyline could change without confrontation. Yet the systems that produced the mansion did not disappear with it. They adapted. Wealth evolved, learning to be quieter, more efficient, less visible. Power no longer needed palaces to announce itself. What remained was a lesson hidden in the rubble. The true cost of that mansion was never just financial. It was social. It was cultural. It was moral. The building absorbed the contradictions of its era, standing proudly while inequality deepened around it. Its destruction did not resolve those contradictions. It simply removed the evidence. Generations that followed inherited a simplified version of history. They learned about opportunity without seeing its limits, about ambition without confronting its victims. The absence of the mansion made it harder to ask uncomfortable questions. How was this wealth created? Who paid for it? Why was it allowed to concentrate so extremely? Without physical reminders, such questions faded into academic debate rather than lived reality. The forgetting was not accidental. It was convenient. Remembering would require reckoning, and reckoning disrupts comfort. The mansion challenged the idea that success was purely earned and benevolent. Its existence complicated national myths. Its removal restored narrative control. In choosing to forget the mansion, the country chose simplicity over honesty. It chose forward motion without reflection. The land moved on, but the costs remained embedded in systems that continued to shape opportunity and exclusion. The mansion may have vanished from maps and memory, but the conditions that built it persisted, quieter and more refined. What was lost was not just stone and wood, but a mirror, a structure that once forced confrontation with the extremes of wealth and the silence surrounding its consequences. Without it, the story of prosperity became easier to tell, cleaner, and less complete. Extreme wealth during the Gilded Age did not emerge quietly or organically. It set itself through architecture, scale, and excess, and the mansion stood as its most visible declaration. These structures were never just private residences. They were physical statements meant to be seen, admired, and accepted as proof that enormous inequality was not only normal, but deserved. Behind every marble staircase and imported chandelier was a system designed to concentrate wealth at the very top while rendering the labor that sustained it nearly invisible. The mansion's grandeur depended on thousands of hands that history rarely names. Stone was quarried, timber was hauled, metals were forged, fabrics were stitched, and landscapes were reshaped by workers whose lives existed far from the elegance they created. Many lived in crowded conditions, worked long hours, and earned wages that barely sustained them, while the final product symbolized effortless luxury. The building appeared serene and permanent, but its creation was marked by exhaustion, risk, and inequality that never appeared in society pages or architectural praise. This imbalance was not accidental. The Gilded Age operated on the belief that wealth was a sign of merit and that those who possessed it had earned the right to display it without restraint. Mansions became a visual language of dominance. Size mattered. Height mattered. Imported materials mattered. Each design choice reinforced the idea that power belonged to a small elite whose resources were limitless, even as the surrounding society struggled with poverty, labor unrest, and instability. Inside these homes, luxury became a form of insulation. Thick walls and expansive grounds separated owners from the realities that made their lifestyle possible. Servants moved quietly through hidden corridors, maintaining an illusion of ease and order. Their presence was essential, yet deliberately minimized. They were meant to disappear into the background, ensuring that wealth appeared self-sustaining, almost natural. The mansion did not just conceal labor, it normalized its erasure. Beyond the household staff, entire industries revolved around sustaining these estates. Builders, craftsmen, gardeners, and suppliers formed an economic ecosystem that served a tiny fraction of the population. While this provided employment, it also locked workers into roles that supported inequality rather than challenged it. The wealth flowed upward, while dependency flowed downward. The mansion stood as the visible peak of this structure, while its foundation rested on countless unseen lives. The social message was clear. Wealth was not meant to be questioned, only admired. Public fascination with these estates turned inequality into spectacle. Newspapers chronicled parties, guests, and renovations with awe, reinforcing the idea that extreme wealth was aspirational, rather than exploitative. The human cost was rarely part of the story. The mansion became a cultural distraction, shifting attention away from labor conditions and toward fa. Even the land itself carried hidden costs. Entire communities were displaced to make room for estates that served only a few. Natural landscapes were reshaped, fenced off, and privatized. What had once been shared space became a symbol of exclusion. The mansion did not simply occupy land, it redefined who had the right to occupy space at all. Over time, the building hardened into a symbol that went beyond individual wealth. It represented a system that rewarded accumulation without responsibility. Philanthropy, when it existed, often functioned as reputation management rather than structural change. Donations softened criticism while leaving the underlying inequalities intact. The mansion remained untouched, its existence justified by selective generosity. The contrast between inside and outside grew sharper as society evolved. Industrial growth brought urban crowding, labor movements, and calls for reform. Yet the mansion stood firm, protected by wealth and influence. It projected stability while the world around it strained under economic pressure. This contrast revealed how disconnected extreme wealth had become from collective reality. What made the mansion particularly powerful was its ability to turn inequality into tradition. Once built, it became heritage. Once inherited, it became legacy. Over time, the story shifted from how the wealth was created to how long it had existed. Longevity replaced accountability. The mansion no longer needed justification. Its continued presence became the justification. In this way, extreme wealth did more than create monuments. It created narratives that protected itself. The mansion was not just stone and steel, it was an argument made visible, insisting that inequality was not a failure of the system, but its highest achievement. As time passed, the very structures that once symbolized triumph began to reveal their fragility. The mansion, designed to project permanence, struggled to adapt to a changing world. What had been built for a specific moment of excess became increasingly difficult to justify, maintain, or even inhabit. The cost of preserving these vast estates grew heavier as social values shifted and the economic landscape evolved beyond the conditions that had created them. The families who once filled these rooms with noise, servants, and spectacle found themselves confronting a new reality. Inherited wealth no longer guaranteed stability. Taxes rose, public scrutiny intensified, and the labor required to operate such properties became harder to sustain. What once functioned as a seamless display of power now felt like a burden. The mansion, rather than protecting wealth, began to expose its vulnerabilities. Maintenance alone demanded enormous resources. Roofs aged, stone cracked, and interiors required constant restoration. Heating and staffing these structures became impractical as lifestyles modernized. The scale that once impressed now worked against them. Rooms went unused. Wings were closed. The mansion slowly emptied, not with a dramatic collapse, but with quiet retreat. Wealth that had once insisted on visibility now sought discretion. Social attitudes also shifted. The public no longer viewed extreme displays of luxury with the same admiration. What had once seemed aspirational began to feel out of step with a society facing economic uncertainty and calls for fairness. The mansion's symbolism changed. Instead of representing success, it increasingly represented excess, detachment, and inequality. Its presence invited questions rather than applause. This shift in perception altered how these properties were treated. Some were sold, others subdivided, and many were abandoned altogether. Estates that once hosted grand gatherings fell silent, their halls echoing with absence. Without constant care, nature reclaimed what had been meticulously controlled. Gardens overgrew, windows shattered, and interiors decayed. The illusion of permanence dissolved faster than anyone expected. In many cases, these mansions were repurposed. They became schools, hospitals, museums, or government buildings. This transformation was often framed as preservation, but it also marked an acknowledgement that their original purpose no longer fit modern life. The homes built to serve a single family now required public justification to survive. Their survival depended on reinvention, not legacy alone. Others were not so fortunate. Demolition became a practical solutio. To an inconvenient past. Entire estates were dismantled, their materials sold off, their histories reduced to photographs and anecdotes. What had once been symbols of dominance vanished quietly, making room for development, infrastructure, or housing. The disappearance was rarely mourned publicly, suggesting that the cultural attachment to these monuments had weakened. This erasure revealed something deeper. The mansion had always relied on collective acceptance to maintain its meaning. When society stopped believing in the narrative it represented, the structure lost its power. Stone and marble could not defend themselves against changing values. Without admiration, the mansion was just a building, expensive and impractical. The forgetting was not accidental. Remembering the full story behind these estates would require confronting uncomfortable truths about inequality, exploitation, and imbalance. It was easier to let them fade than to ask why they existed in the first place. By allowing them to disappear, society avoided reckoning with the systems that built them. Yet traces remained. Foundations lingered beneath new developments. Place names preserved echoes of former owners. Archival images circulated online, detached from context. These fragments hinted at a past that had shaped the present, even if it was no longer visible. The absence itself became a kind of legacy, one defined by silence rather than celebration. The decline of these mansions mirrored a broader transformation in how wealth functioned. Power became less architectural and more abstract. Influence shifted from land and buildings to finance, corporations, and networks. Wealth no longer needed physical monuments to assert itself. In this transition, the mansion became obsolete, a relic of a time when dominance had to be seen to be believed. This shift did not eliminate inequality, it merely changed its form. The disappearance of mansions did not signal the disappearance of concentrated wealth, only its relocation. Power learned to operate without spectacle, making it harder to recognize and challenge. The fall of the mansion was not the end of excess, but the end of its most visible expression. What remains is a landscape shaped by absence. Where grand estates once stood, there are roads, buildings, and neighborhoods with no memory of what came before. The forgetting feels natural, almost intentional. By erasing the physical reminders, society distances itself from the choices that created them. In this way, the decline of the mansion reveals a second cost of Gilded Age wealth. The first was inequality made visible. The second is historical amnesia. When monuments vanish, so do the conversations they provoke. The disappearance allows the past to feel distant, disconnected from present systems that continue to reward accumulation over accountability. The mansion was never meant to last forever, despite its appearance. Its collapse, whether through decay or demolition, exposes the temporary nature of symbols built on imbalance. What endures is not the structure, but the system that replaced it, quieter, more efficient, and less visible. Continuing its work without marble walls to draw attention to the cost. As the physical presence of these mansions faded, something more subtle took their place, a shift in how society understood wealth, success, and legacy. The disappearance of these estates did not mean the end of elite influence, but it marked a turning point in how that influence was expressed. Where power had once demanded visibility, it now preferred distance. The grand mansion, once a declaration of arrival, became an uncomfortable reminder of an era that no longer aligned with modern narratives of progress. The families who survived this transition adapted quickly. They learned that influence no longer required vast properties open to public admiration. Privacy became the new luxury. Wealth retreated behind corporate structures, financial instruments, and anonymous ownership. Power became mobile, flexible, and harder to trace. The old estates, fixed in place and burdened by history, could not compete with this new form of control. This transformation altered public perception. Without towering mansions to point to, inequality became less tangible. It was easier to believe wealth was dispersed or earned through merit when its most extreme symbols were gone. The absence of these buildings softened the visual language of disparity. Inequality did not disappear, but it became abstract, existing in numbers, policies, and systems rather than stone and land. Memory played a critical role in this shift. As generations passed, fewer people remembered what had stood on those grounds. Stories faded, replaced by simplified narratives of progress and modernization. The land was repurposed, renamed, and recontextualized. Without physical reminders, the past lost urgency. The mansion's collapse made it easier to detach current realities from their historical roots. This forgetting had consequences. Without a clear connection to how wealth had once been accumulated and displayed, discussions about fairness and responsibility became shallow. The systems that enabled extreme concentration of resources continued, but their origins were obscured. The mansion, for all its excess, had been honest in its message. It showed, without explanation, how unequal the distribution of power truly was. Its disappearance removed that clarity. The cultural shift also influenced aspiration. Earlier generations measured success through land, architecture, and permanence. Later generations pursued liquidity, influence, and speed. Wealth was no longer something to be anchored in place, but something to be moved, multiplied, and shielded. The mansion, slow and immovable, became incompatible with this mindset. Public institutions inherited part of this legacy. Museums and historic societies preserved fragments of these estates, often framed as art or architectural achievement rather than economic warning. Visitors admired craftsmanship while remaining disconnected from the labor and imbalance that made it possible. Preservation without context turned history into aesthetic experience, stripping it of its lessons. In some cases, nostalgia replaced critique. Images of lost mansions circulated online, romanticized as symbols of elegance and refinement. This selective memory softened the reality of exploitation and excess. The mansion became a fantasy rather than a warning. Its destruction was mourned not for what it represented, but for what it appeared to be. This romanticization further distanced the public from the structural realities of wealth. When symbols are aestheticized, their consequences are neutralized. The mansion, once a provocation, became decoration. Its fall no longer raised questions about inequality, but about lost beauty. The conversation shifted away from accountability toward sentiment. Meanwhile, the mechanisms of modern wealth continued to expand. Financial centers replaced estate grounds as the true sites of power. Decisions affecting millions were made in offices with no architectural grandeur, no public tours, and no visible trace of excess. Power became efficient, streamlined, and invisible. This invisibility became its greatest strength. The disappearance of the mansion also reshaped urban development. Land once reserved for a single family was open to many. On the surface, it seemed democratic. Yet the benefits were uneven. Development often favored profit over community, replacing one form of exclusion with another. The mansion's removal did not guarantee equity, it simply cleared space for new dynamics to emerge. The final cost, then, was not just the loss of a building, but the loss of confrontation. Mansions forced society to see wealth up close, to walk past it, to live in its shadow. Their absence removed that daily reminder. Inequality became something discussed in theory rather than encountered in reality. What replaced the mansion was a system far more resilient. It did not rely on admiration or visibility. It did not require public approval. It operated quietly, adapting to criticism rather than resisting it. In this sense, the destruction of the mansion marked not the decline of elite power, but its evolution. The mansion was an honest symbol. It did not pretend to be modest. It stood as proof of who had won and who had not. Its fall allowed wealth to adopt a more palatable image, one aligned with modern values of innovation and efficiency. This shift made inequality easier to tolerate, harder to challenge, and more deeply embedded. In forgetting the mansion, society did not escape the cost of Gilded Age wealth. It merely postponed the reckoning. The structures that replaced it carried the same imbalances, stripped of spectacle and wrapped in abstraction. The true legacy of these forgotten estates is not their absence, but the system that learned to survive without them, continuing forward without monuments, without memory, and without interruption. The mansion did not disappear by accident, and it was not forgotten because it lacked importance. It vanished because it told a story that became inconvenient. Its walls spoke too clearly about how wealth was gathered, how power was displayed, and how deeply unequal the foundations of that world truly were. When the building stood, it forced a confrontation. When it fell, that confrontation ended. What replaced it was not fairness, but subtlety. Power learned to move without leaving footprints. Wealth no longer needed architecture to announce itself. It shifted into systems, corporations, and financial structures that were harder to see and even harder to question. The destruction of the mansion was presented as progress, yet the forces that created it continued, refined and protected from scrutiny. By erasing the most visible symbols of excess, society made inequality easier to ignore. Without towering estates dominating the landscape, wealth appeared less extreme, more reasonable, more deserved. The public lost a physical reminder of imbalance, and in its place grew abstraction, where numbers replaced stone and influence replaced land. The true cost of Gilded Age wealth was never confined to a single estate. It lived on in habits, expectations, and structures passed quietly from one generation to the next. The mansion was only the surface. Beneath it remained the same concentrated power, now free from visibility and accountability. In choosing to forget these buildings, America did not escape its past, it concealed it, and the moment a society hides the price of power is the moment it guarantees that the bill will come due again.